a dialogue with Shastri Ramachandaran. I've known Shastri for almost 50 years as a conscientious, energetic journalist committed to social justice and human rights. I talked to him about the politics he has seen evolving, the relationship between media and the government, about opportunities for the younger generation to become journalists in an environment that seems so constrained in terms of a freedom of a journalist to express the truth. So over to Shastri Ramachandran. Hi, Shastri. It's so nice to see you after a long time. I'm excited to talk to you because as a part of my curiosity and the dialogue that I want to present in front of the younger generation, the life you have led, the profession you have chosen is a critical part of India's imagination and your role both as a participant and as an observer in shaping that imagination. So thank you. You had a long, cherished career as a journalist and commentator, and I've known you for a very long time. And I couldn't think of anybody but you to have a perspective on media, journalism, and its role in shaping India's imagination. So thank you. And let me start with the first question.
Thank you, Uday. Yes, please ask your first question and then I shall.
So the first question is that I want to take a long-term view from the past to the future. You have lived in different countries, you've visited different countries, you've lived in China, you've lived in an evolving democracy which has seen shades of autocracy also. And then you've lived in China where there's an entirely different model of governance. What do you think is a universal role of a journalist?
I think the universal goal of a journalist is to inform. But when you say inform, you have to be informed yourself. You have to actualize, realize your right to information while respecting the subject's right to be informed, to inform the way they want to be. Especially when you look at post-colonial societies, it's very important, for instance, that when you are in India, you don't say, oh, this is happening in Bangladesh because they have been always like this, they are lazy or they are backward. No. So they have a right to how they are perceived by those who exercise their right to information. So I think this is an important part of how one exercises one's freedom of expression. Because to be a journalist means to exercise your freedom of expression at all times. But as everyone acknowledges, your freedom to express yourself, whether physically or verbally, stops where the other man's nose or face begins, you see. So one has to be respectful of that. Secondly, I would like to go back a little to your introductory remarks. You know, Professor Madhu Dandavate, your father, was a personal friend of mine, of ours, both me and Archita's. And I had met him. I don't remember whether I had met him first or I had met you first, but I think I met him first and I met you later because you were with Archana in London and so on. But we were in contact before the emergency briefly. We had met on occasions. During the emergency, of course, there was no question of meeting, although I was in touch with a lot of these socialist leaders and I was in Madras at that time. And it is after the emergency that I came into greater contact with him and we had kind of also a sort of continued association. For instance, I speak about the emergency because the emergency was a coming of age for journalists like me, those who were born after 1947. Those who were there before 47 had a different experience of journalism. They had the lived experience of not only Gandhi, but so many other great communicators of the freedom movement who themselves were outstanding journalists. Whereas for us, that was only received wisdom. And actually, one didn't think about that when you wanted to be a journalist. When you wanted to be a journalist, it was like when you wanted to have your cigarette, you thought of how glamorous the profession is. You see, that's how you kind of, oh, you're free. You don't have a boss. You don't have to listen to anybody. You meet people who are in authority. You can ask them the questions. You can expose them and so on. And my experience was I had been writing in my school journal, in my college journal, and during college we worked on an intercollegiate kind of publication and so on. And I used to write for one of the publications called Youth Times, which was brought out by the Times of India group. But still, later on, I came to realize that that might have been part of journalism then for those who are publishing it, but it did not conscientize me towards what being a journalist meant. So I became, I think, more conscious, more aware of my responsibilities as well as my duties. My duties were more onerous than my responsibilities because of the emergency and what we could not report during the emergency. And also how you could report certain things during the emergency, and you could report something the way the establishment wanted, and still it might communicate something which was not intended. So before I come to that, I would like to speaking about your father, because one is also talking about values that he held very dear. And I share those values. First and foremost is democracy, freedom, and human rights, and that one constantly occupies these spaces and asserts our right to occupy it. It is not enough to speak about it or to assert the right while being removed from it. And we discovered this while raising the question of civil liberties in Tamil Nadu. Because one of the myths of the emergency was that there were no emergency excesses or atrocities in the South. As your father, Madhu, and several socialists particularly knew, there were indeed atrocities and excesses in the South too. The socialists were detained in the Bangalore prison. M.S. Apparao from Madras was also detained in the prison in Bangalore, along with so many others, and Michael Fernandez and all those people. And then in Madras itself, there were a lot of atrocities, and across Tamil Nadu, there were encounter cases, and one of the DMK MPs was tortured in prison and he died. So all these excesses were there. So
even
one of the first
Reddy, even Snehalata Reddy.
Snehalata Reddy, yes. Yeah. And we again were reminded of it when Nandana Reddy was protesting against Indira Gandhi's election to the Lok Sabha, re-election to the Lok Sabha from Chikmagalur constituency in Karnataka, which I happened to cover as a correspondent of Deccan Herald. Although I was in Madras, I had gone there. Now, so one of the first things we did was we inquired into some of the excesses of the emergency in Tamil Nadu. We took up one case of a person who was killed in an encounter. We formed the Tamil Nadu Civil Liberties Association, which was not pre-existent. And we held a meeting during the state assembly election. And we wanted to highlight that this had been an issue. And none of the parties were interested in this. Neither the DMK nor the ADM. The DMK, of course, having been a victim, had far more serious persuasions to continue its campaign the way it was doing. So we asked several other politicians, but many of them declined. When they came, oh, they were ministers, they were busy, it's a new government. And your father was the railway minister in the Janata Party government. So we asked him, we sent word to him in Delhi that we would like him to address a meeting of the civil liberties. He immediately agreed. When he came to Madras, the Janata Party people said, oh, he won't have time. We met him, we said, yes, I have kept time for you. You're meeting at 7 or 8 o'clock. So it was really a surprise. And it was like a break in the political culture of Tamil Nadu, that somebody like that would come and speak on civil liberties platform. So that was a kind of association we had. There were also personal associations I had. I'll come to that later. But speaking about the emergency, For instance, apart from these atrocities, then you had the Rajan case in Kerala where a student was killed. So you had it in Kerala. In Andhra Pradesh, you had so many encounters during this thing. And of more than 20 people arrested just a little before the emergency and after, I think barely one or two were convicted actually, you know. So the atrocities during the emergency were a kind of extrajudicial action against people, you know, in terms of coercion and killing and violence and so on. And it continued in the state, in the way after the election, Janata Party elections and the Congress Party, the emergency regime was kind of defeated electorally. But during the emergency, there was a very, very interesting incident that Muhammad Yunus, who was the Prime Minister's special envoy, he had come to Madras during the emergency. He was addressing a meeting at the press club, and everybody thought, well, this guy will speak, blah, blah, blah. It should, this thing. So I was one of the more, I was probably with the Indian Express, which was the best paper to be in at that time. And I was assigned to cover the meeting. And Muhammad Yunus spoke, he ranted against all these people campaigning against the emergency in the West. And he said, all those who go West are criminals. Somehow I felt there is news in that because a number of people who go West are from the families of the most privileged, including those who are in government and in politics. So when the editor said, no, we'll have to send it to Delhi for the editor-in-chief to see this thing, report, and then cleared it. Then it came cleared by the editor-in-chief. And then it was published, and next day there was a hue and cry. They said, no, this is not the way he had spoken, and blah, blah, blah. And you'll be very surprised that I got a call from a German journalist who had also covered the thing. And he sent word to me, to somebody else, saying that if you are in trouble and you want a recording of it, we have a recording, you let us know. So if there were hidden fears, there are also hidden possibilities.
Yes. That is a very important thing you said. And I almost, just as you said, for Indian media and journalism, emergency was almost like a training ground to be fearless.
Yes.
And because there wasn't such a blatant environment in which to test one's own courage, one's own resilience, and also invisible infrastructure that was available to support the underground media also. And of course, I remember there were 3 publications: Himmat, Opinion by A.D. Gorwala, and Sadhna by Yaduna Thatte, who continued to be in the open. So there is a range of possibilities. And I think that is what the journalists of the time, depending on how much they were willing to write and speak up, had many options to get the information through.
No, this was also a kind of process of education for us. For instance, I had not heard of Gorwala or had occasion to read the opinion. Being in the Indian Express, the other newspapers I read were the contemporaries like the Hindu or the Times of India or the Statesman or the Hindustan Times. So one had seen this, one knew about the Economic and Political Weekly or the Mainstream and some of these magazines. There were not very many other magazines then. But during the emergency, one came to know about journals like Opinion of Gorwala. There was also a small 4-page, what one might call today an A4 size pamphlet type of thing, brochure, brought out by a man called Dr. M.M. Thomas, who was also famous during the emergency. And then there were these, for instance, it's amazing that I think the circulation of Gorwala's writings, because they went to different places, it probably increased enormously during the emergency without any monetary benefit to the publisher or to the editor. That was one thing. Second, it's very interesting that in those days there was no photocopier in India. So anything that you had to put out had to be cyclostyled. You know? And it was very difficult that one had to be very careful where you went to get things cyclostyled. Because we had realized that because we used to file reports as journalists from the post office by way of telegrams or telex messages. I didn't use telex at that time, but telegram. And those guys at the post office, some of them no, but some of them said no. These reports you go somewhere and else and file, you know. Otherwise, there would be some problem. They never explained what problem, but later they told us that there are times when we are told to give them the copies of the reports we have transmitted, you know. So after all, at that time they felt we are government employees and we are expected to do something by another government department. So those things we learned. And also I learned a lot about the constitution and the rights we have under the constitution, the processes for judicial relief. One followed very, very closely many of the cases, the Jabalpur, case of the right to life itself could be taken away, which was upheld by Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, his son. Yashwant Chandrachud is now the Chief Justice, and I think he is kind of setting up exceptional benchmarks, which has lifted expectations of the judiciary to unprecedented heights among the public. Mm-hmm. So one slowly came, despite the ponderousness that our courts being Kafkaesque and everything, that the judiciary as an institution is perhaps the nearest ally that one can have after parliament, where the press is concerned among the institutions. Because with the executive, there is always an adversarial, but alongside the adversarial, also a, a subliminal incestuous relationship. Like today, one would say it is more incestuous than adversarial. In fact, there is very little adversarial relationship at all. Sometimes it is very hard to say where these government authorities putting out information and those receiving the information, where the one process ends and the other begins.
Absolutely. But to that, I have one question. You talked about judiciary and media having this kind of a joint role in bringing information or preserving democracy, whatever you may call it. But is there a close communication between judiciary and media, or do they talk to each other from a distance?
Actually, there is not much direct communication between judiciary and media, because I have had at times to cover the court. The coverage of the courts was very, very different in my time. In fact, I think sometimes all the three newspapers in Madras used to depend on one legal reporter. He used to go to the court and come back around 4 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and he will type the report. So I remember he was a very venerable old gentleman, Mr. Krishnamurthy, who used to wear a turban and fully buttoned coat with his dhoti and in Madras, and he'll come with his umbrella in the dead heat of the afternoon. And often the cases were, unless very, very important, what was heard yesterday, or the orders were passed earlier today morning. And then he would get it from the clerks or this thing. And he knew the judges, and many of the judges knew him. So one day, apparently, the chief reporter told him, see, the report in the Mail and the Indian Express our report are the same. So he said, what did you expect? The same judge will write a different judgment for Indian Express and another one for the Mail. Of course, the same report I have written for both people, because it is the same case and the same judge. So nobody thought, not many papers had full-time legal correspondents. I think the Hindu had one in Delhi for a Supreme Court. Perhaps the Indian Express and the national newspapers all had one. But later it has become a very coveted position, very important position, that of the legal correspondent. And in those days, when I went to the High Court, then the clerk would say, no, why have you come? Where is Mr. Krishnamurthy? No, we can't open our files and all to all and sundry. So access to information on what the courts had decided was not so easily accessible. First. Second,
so
today,
yes. In not so distant past,
yes,
a group of judges, Supreme Court judges, came out accusing the Chief Justice of corruption, and they held a press conference. You remember that time?
Yes, I remember that Telemeshwar was there, and Justice Madan Lokur and one other judge was there, three of them.
So that
When
was
Ranjan
one
Gogoi was
area where the communication between judiciary and the media got bridged.
yes.
So in such a situation, what is the role of media? Is it to maintain distance or to get engaged and dig out for more?
See, there are times when the media has to be a participant, because earlier you referred, in your very opening remarks, you referred to a journalist or media being participant and observer. You know, there is a very thin dividing line between the two, and you have to keep crossing the lines at times, but you have to decide how far you cross the line and how quickly you come back to the side you were in, because you are on the other side. You cannot be an embedded journalist, except under extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary circumstances means immediately after the Janata Party came to power, there were embedded journalists with the Janata Party. And equally, there were very loyal votaries of the emergency who were embedded journalists with the Congress Party too. There were embedded journalists with the DMK who felt, well, we stand for freedom, we stand for democracy. Who are you guys, the other parties wouldn't stand up for it. So that was one thing. Second, we all felt that you can't say you give equal space to this party and to that party, because the party which had imposed censorship and suppressed the media, one always tended to look at it, view the party and its actions with a little hostility. It took a long time, and you had to persuade yourself that when you are reporting or writing, you cannot allow that hostility to creep into your reports, because you have to write for all readers, regardless of which party they are supporting, not only for people who are thinking like you. And it took me a long time, probably several years, to understand from many editors that I don't have to write for the converted, because when they see my writing, they would know who is writing and on which side I stand. But it is my language and how I frame my stories and what I'm telling for those who are not converted, whom I will draw towards what I'm trying to communicate, that is more important. Because every time I win over a few more people who are persuaded to come to the same conclusion that I have in the writing of my report without explicitly putting forward a conclusion, then a greater purpose is served than merely earning the applause of those who think like me and see things the way I do. So this was one thing. And
that brings
often I
another
was criticized.
brings another observation in my mind. Unlike we inherited, or rather we borrowed the British parliamentary system. And of course, we had our own constitution amendments. But kind of in spirit, we continue to use that. Now, in England, if you see today, prime ministers keep changing over the last several years. And the party procedures, methods for electing a prime minister are rigorous, grassroots level. We saw it recently when Rishi Sunak got elected. So people have a higher level of maturity in how the prime minister is elected, how the party in power is either rejected or elected. Whereas here we tend to focus a lot on the persons as opposed to party or the democratic process. And so in that context, my question to you is, you just talked about it was hard to have a bias against the party that imposed press censorship. So what would it take, or has the media matured to separate policies and politics from people who exercise it? And the reason why I ask is today, we see the situation as reversed. People who were in prison during emergency are being accused of being autocrats and destroying the constitution. And people who are the autocrats and destroying the constitution, the party is now fighting for democratic rights and for the future of country. So how do you Number one, how does media reconcile to that, and how do people reconcile to that? Whose responsibility is it to elevate the popular thinking imagination above personalities?
Now, one can't say the media has done that. The media is actually not doing it, is not lifting politics, policies, and processes above personalities today. In sharp contrast, the journalists are very clear and can make these distinctions. And you can see that this is reflected in media other than big media. Big media has too many interests and too much money at stake to offend the authorities. They are in the business of newspapering. They are not in the business of public service journalism any longer. They perhaps were. Like even in the 70s when I was working in Madras, there was a Tamil paper called Swadesha Mitra. It was a paper of the freedom movement. It was a Congress party newspaper. But although it was a Congress paper, everybody respected the newspaper for being a newspaper of the freedom movement. And every now and then it would run out of money. And then there would be an appeal for funds and there would be money from the public to revive the newspaper. I don't think that can happen today for all the social media, crowdfunding possibilities and things like that. If a newspaper is dying, people will say, let it die. Like for instance, one of India's finest newspapers, one of Asia's greatest newspapers, I would say one of the world's great newspapers, The Hindu, is today facing a serious existential threat because it has decided to remain independent. And I think the emergency was also taught a lesson to a newspaper like The Hindu, because during the emergency, its editor was G. Kasturi, who was also chairman of Samachar, which was a merged outfit of all the four news agencies, PTI, UNI, Hindustan Samachar, and this one other agency. So after that, the first time the Hindu used the word authoritarianism was only after the 78, 79, probably in 80. And during the 1980 elections, it was the first time there were editorials. Of course, there had been a change of people at the helm. There was no more one editor having the last word. There are other people, definitely family members, but who had their way and who had their views, who could make it more realistic. And but today, there are many things in that paper one doesn't agree with, but it is a great newspaper. And now one actually fears how long it will be allowed to survive. In sharp contrast, a paper like Deccan Herald, although uncompromisingly, it continues to flourish because it's a Karnataka-based paper, its bases are there. But otherwise, big newspapers in Delhi, I find that by and large, there is an overwhelming bias towards the government of the day, towards the personalities in government of the day. And parliament coverage has diminished to a very large extent. I used to go to parliament even before this government or the COVID and all, when a lot of people were not coming to parliament. The number of people actually sitting in the gallery and covering parliament has fallen abysmally. And people are not familiar with parliamentary processes. Even many journalists are not familiar. And people inside the newspaper office in the editorial know even less. At one time, there were processes and programs to ensure that people in the editorial desk were as informed as the reporters about how parliament works, what are its processes, what are its... Today, there is no such effort at all. So
I have a comment there.
Yeah.
My background is actually the place where I have numerous times, hundreds of times, entered the Parliament gallery. This is the entrance to the gallery. And I watched proceedings for many years. One thing that has changed today that may affect journalists' attitude towards or interest in the Parliament proceedings is that people feel the debates in parliaments have been compromised and undermined in their influence over how policies are made, decisions are made by those in power. So if those in power have undermined the system, the journalists will go where the information is, and then parliament becomes a place where, while some people are still trying to raise their voice and create a debate, but if there isn't a counterpoint to a point, it becomes compromised. What do you think?
No, you're right. You're right. But far from this happening at that level, it is happening at a structural, institutional level itself. Parliament is being demeaned and diminished.
Mhm.
For instance, what has put? Let us take first Parliament as a space. As a space, it should be huge. It's an institution by itself. It is not an extension of the government. It is not merely a facilitator of the executive. The executive is a product of parliamentary sanction and approval. Far from that, today, the executive is kind of overshadows parliament to a great extent. And you will find this word is spread, oh, parliament canteen food is so cheap. So that's why people are there. What do these MPs do? Oh, they don't do anything. Maybe what is telecast by the Lok Sabha or the House television is what is on record or official or the ruling party. But there are a lot of things that are going on. Then there are a lot of committees, parliamentary committees, which are sitting and people are working and there are officials, hundreds of them. And it is actually a whole world by itself. But far from that, it is being reduced every day. Oh, it is parliament. I think it is just a section of the state and not an independent and the very basis of the government and democracy and our system of laws and kind of taking forward the constitution and its kind of provisions. No, that is no longer a perception of parliament. Oh, MPs are going to. I mean, these guys spend crores of rupees. Are they coming to parliament to eat chicken for 40 rupees? Who are the people who eat in the parliament canteen? It is those poor chaps, all those security guards and all these chaps. Like in any government office, they too need a place to eat. In all government offices, there are canteens which are subsidized to some extent. Parliament is no different from that, first. Second, I have sat through debates. And for instance, nobody celebrates and constantly reminds ourselves, like this bill on the transgender bill, which was moved in Parliament, which was a private member's bill moved by Tiruchi Shiva of the DMK. I think this was the first private member's bill in probably 30 or 40 years, and he has studied the transgender situation in so many countries. I'm told he did the study of maybe 30, 40 or 50 countries. It's an extraordinary amount of work. Now, this is not so. There was a mental health bill coming up, and I was sitting in Parliament. There was a member of Parliament from West Bengal, and she was perhaps a doctor, and I think she was a doctor, and going through the bill provision by provision, what it was not. I didn't find a single mention of these things. Whereas if an MP from the opposition criticizes the government of the thing, yes, it may or may not, all of it may not find mention in the records or even some of the mainstream media, but you could definitely read it in social media or you would get videos and things like that. So this is happening. And there are so many other things like parliamentary fellowships are there for people to study various issues of interest to parliamentarians. This also narrow the pool of people, the pool from which people are chosen, the reservoirs from which you draw talent. All this is, at one time I remember people used to clamor to get any kind of job in parliament, and very proud of it. But including parliament, India's the Rajya Sabha TV, until very recently, when Vice President Hamid Ansari was the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, was a stellar example of a fair and independent media. And that has changed after he left. In fact, I remember, I just finished. There was an occasion when he called those people, he pulled them up. And he said, more and more people feel that because that this is a state-owned channel, they have to do government. He said, no. Government has many channels to publicize what it wants. Your Sansad TV, your parliamentary TV, you stick to covering parliament and what is parliament. So I think I don't think even editors of independent private newspapers are telling their journalists.
So I have a question for you. you have lived through different iterations of Indian democracy, also through different stages of media evolution. You worked from old paper-based newspapers, you're in the digital media now. Uh, is there a hope? Where do people find authentic, truthful information? And where do people express their opinions that is not uh, lost in hateful comments at the bottom of digital media?
No, there are spaces, there are spaces. That is the interesting part of the technology revolution. And people know these things. For instance, the farmers' agitation, just to take an example, quickly give a few examples to illustrate that just as much as technology overwhelms us, promotes and floods uh, mind with all this fake news and falsehoods and propaganda and so on. There's so much of information overload, even without fake news and propaganda and all that, that one has to be attuned to how to pick up what is important, what is relevant, or what is necessary for me to know. 9 out of 10 times, people don't know what is it that they need to know, because unless you know what you need to know, where are you going to find it?
Mhm.
But there are many spaces. I know you perhaps have in mind that some of these sites like Vice and Vox and all have had to shut down recently, because of financial crisis and other things. But here, for instance, although a paper like the Hindu is in deep trouble, I think there are many pieces. One of the finest pieces I read, finest in the sense, a historical, well-backgrounded piece on the violence in this district called New Mewar recently in Haryana, which was once part of Gurgaon but has been separated and ghettoized. And that was by Sukumar Muralidharan in the Hindu. And the same day, they had a piece on Manipur by Sanjay Hazarika, who is a journalist and also a well-regarded voice in India and beyond on the Northeast for many years. He's written books and he's an authority on that. And I was in Bangalore for a day and I saw a piece on page one which had been carried inside. Probably the best piece at that stage when the violence was still unraveling in Manipur by Patricia Mukhem. She is the editor of the Shillong Times. And it's very difficult to report from the Northeast at the best of times. But even in these fraught times, I found she is written with the reported and written about it with extraordinary clarity. So there are people who know where to go. That you go to the Hindu, you go to the Deccan. Then you also have all these online, services like the Wire in India is also a good space to write. So then the economic and political weekly has changed, but it still has where you have serious kind of investigations or reflections or critical pieces to write. That space is there. Then a lot of people are doing pods, they're doing YouTube. Then you have the site called NewsClick. And interestingly, the man who founded and who runs NewsClick, Pravir Purkahesta, and he has been targeted by the government. And he has been under investigation. And he is supposed to have received money from somebody who was once who founded and ran a multinational in the US, an IT company, ThoughtWorks. And he sold his share, and this person had worked for that. But the New York Times doesn't mention anything about NewsClick receiving money from China. But here they built up a whole narrative, along with accusations from the police and the enforcement directorate and all other people, saying they linked up NewsClick to being funded from China. And I have been following NewsClick from some time. During the farmers' agitation, one of their YouTube videos, I'm told, had more than 20 million views worldwide.
Wow.
So this is an extraordinary thing. No Indian printed newspaper has achieved this kind of thing online. So there are many channels like this.
I do remember during emergency, even people in remotest village used to turn on BBC.
Yes.
Because that's where they knew you could get authentic information. So considering everything that you just outlined, do you think there is hope for people to find authentic news today?
Yes, there is. There is. You can find it in social media. And actually, it is the fear that other media, especially enabled by information technology, social media, and so on, will put out authentic news, and this will gain currency and this will go viral worldwide. That there are efforts being made by the government to say that they will decide what is fake news and what is not fake news. And they have actually passed a new law for that, where the Press Information Bureau will now say that if you report something, and they will have their own basis and criteria, they will say this is fake news or this is not fake news. Whereas actually there are independent people here like Alt News who verify what is fake news and put out a report.
Yeah, they're the ones who do fact checking, right?
Yes, that is a genuine filter. What is being attempted through this bill is to shovel away news, by kind of discrediting it. Not even because situation is such that if government says something is fake, people will think twice before believing it. So they want to use the force of law, to kind of black it out. And this is what is happening now. This is what is likely to happen.
Yeah, in fact,
not yet begun to happen.
In fact, emergency has showed us,
yes,
when autocrats control information, the first person who gets blinded by the truth is the autocrat herself or himself.
Yes.
Because real people will find the right information, but the minions of the autocrats will block the real information from her or him because they fear for their anger being directed for telling them the truth. And I think one reason why some of the accesses also happened is because there was no feedback mechanism there.
True.
So then I have one question for you. Today, I am dismayed that many of my friends, family, are affected by government propaganda, underground propaganda by the idealists, the nationalists or religious nationalists, and third, the WhatsApp university. Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't blame them. It's just that that information is being bombarded on them. What do I tell them? How do they find the truth? Can you give like an idiot's guide to finding the truth?
Whenever people have asked me, I tell them, read the Hindu, read the Deccan Herald, check out the Wire, and then read the Indian Express Delhi edition. And you see, slowly newspapers change. Now, because of what Deccan Herald is doing, the Indian Express in the south, the southern edition, New Indian Express, you see, I maybe it was there before, but I have noticed of late their tone and coverage and the bias in their coverage has completely changed of late. Or there is definitely another bias coming into their coverage. Maybe other biases are there. I don't follow those papers very regularly online or anything. But I think in the South, the BJP has no government. So I think the political realities on the ground are very, very different, first. Second, the Congress Party's victory in Karnataka is something that is being celebrated by everybody, except those who continue to have their pathological hatred of the Congress Party, even from before the emergency or from beginning with the emergency or during Nehruvian times, whatever, which I think is highly irrational. If they can seek all things British, despite the horrors of colonialism, I don't understand it. And I look at a party and its politics and its persons for what they are today, what they did yesterday, what can be expected of them. I cannot hold Rahul Gandhi responsible for what Rajiv Gandhi or Sonia Gandhi did, for what Nehru did, for Indira Gandhi did. I don't expect him to defend that. I don't expect him to carry forward that either. I will look at him in terms of what is the position he is taking, what is his politics. And I think more than many of the kind of right-wing intellectuals, even with big institutions and think tanks, the people of Karnataka have realized this because the victory of the Congress party is spectacular. In no election has any party got this kind of a majority,
I have a
So,
question here. Since you mentioned
so
Rahul
as I said,
Gandhi,
read these newspapers.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was reading a bunch of your online articles, and I think
Yes.
5 years ago, you wrote
Yeah.
an article for Congress to move forward. They need to dump Rahul Gandhi. You had
Yes.
written an
Yes.
article.
Yes.
How do you react to your own article from 5 years ago?
Yes. I've changed my opinion of him today.
Hmm.
Rahul Gandhi at that time, for what he was not doing or doing, was not helping the Congress party.
Hmm.
And whether true or not, it was leading to the perception that this is a bequest he has taken for his benefit. Over the years, I have followed him very closely, unaffected by the propaganda of calling him Pappu. I think, and this Pappu kind of thing they have painted him has been one of the vilest and most successful technology-driven online campaigns ever, I think. I think it has been even more successful than the campaign of Richard Nixon and the way he was sold, which is brought out very well in a book by Joe McGinnis called The Selling of Richard Nixon. It's a very famous book on how he says, oh, Richard Nixon's face might look like a pig's ass in the moonlight, but our job is to say he is the best, he is the greatest, and so on. So this was a reverse effect of that, where Rahul Gandhi was painted like that. Whereas actually he had been ineffective. Then I've looked at his body language. He is not interested in becoming prime minister. He is not in quest of seats of power. He is not interested in becoming president of the Congress party. But the party itself has got accustomed to certain reflexes. Like when somebody like Kharge is made president, everybody expects he will still, one doesn't know whether he should look to Rahul Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi, because everybody expects him to, or they expect him to, or people around him expect. But now it has been made very clear, the way the Karnataka situation evolved, how it was managed, who was made, that Kharge has been given a free hand. So Rahul Gandhi is standing outside the party. And I think it is important to have, like during Nehru's time, you have congressmen who will stand outside government, who will also distance themselves from all organizational activities without being involved in every bit of it, so that they can also say my organization is doing wrong in the state, And that never affected the Congress party's fortunes for many decades. Why should it affect now? In
Yeah,
spite of all
I remember during the Janata government of 77, people like Surendra Mohan and Nanaji Deshmukh sat outside of the government, or even Chandrasekhar, and they had immense influence on the shaping of the policies that time.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so there should be, people should sit out. So I think he is a person who is also evolved. I think he has actually got blooded and earned his spurs, I would say, by this Bharat Jodo Yatra, where people have come to see him for what he is. And I don't think people like Raghuram Rajan, Prashant Bhushan, all these people, or Kanaya Kumar, would have gone and walked with him for 2 days and 3 days just for media spotlight. Or they're very serious people, very serious in their understanding
Or
of
even Medha
politics.
Patkar.
Yes. So I think perceptions about Rahul Gandhi are changing. I don't know whether all of this will be reflected in elections and politics and the party's fortune. That is a different thing. But just 3 days ago, somebody said that somewhere the prime minister was speaking, and he had so many thousand YouTube hits his thing. Whereas Rahul Gandhi's was 3 times more or 4 times more, whatever it may be. I don't even know if it is true. But one doesn't know when it is happening, in what situations, on what topics. But if such things are happening, it shows a change. Whether one is against the prime minister or for the prime minister or not, or for the ruling party is not a question. The question is, we need an important counter presence outside of the ruling party. We need an important space of protest, of opposition. And I see Rahul Gandhi not so much as a Congress leader, no. I see him and even Priyanka Gandhi today as the most, what shall I say, the most visible and energetic face of public protest. I mean, they have fearlessly stood up to every kind of challenge or attempt to suppress them by the agencies of the government. And few people, who are less privileged and less entitled have done this. So I think one should look at them for their actions. And similarly, Priyanka was credited for the outcome in Himachal Pradesh. I haven't followed it so very closely, but if it was, then it's good. Because we need a real alternative, and this is not, they are not congressmen of the, say, the old, they are not chips of the old block, no.
So I want to offer an alternate view which goes beyond what you just said. My observation of the last whatever number of years I have watched politics closely is that any kind of force of change has emerged only when masses have got engaged in some kind of a either suffering or a craving for change.
Yes.
So during emergency, there was both suffering and craving for change. Later on, during Bofors, during Mandal Commission, during Ram Mandir, Rath Yatra, all of those places, there was craving for change. Farmers' movement, there was craving for suffering and craving. Same thing with CAA, protests against that. So I kind of feel that just depending on one leader, such as Rahul Gandhi or Arvind Kejriwal or anybody, or Anna Hazare or Jayaprakash Narayan, to bring about a change is not enough. I think one has to keep watching out and feel in our own way activation of democracy at grassroots level and voicing of alternate points of view fearlessly, and that creates a momentum towards change.
Yes, I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that, except that what you're speaking of is the kind of the crafting of a platform, how it develops, how it builds, what will hold it together, and what are the, and how it should be kind of built to generate certain impulses. I wholly agree with you. But what I am saying that while I agree with all this, that today there are various neutral forces at play, which are neutral, like technology, for instance. Now technology may be neutral, but the control and use of technology is not neutral. It's not politically neutral. The same thing. Social media might be open, but it is not necessarily open to all. Because when you use the coercive power of the state, so legally and otherwise, then social media is in practice not open to all. It terrorizes people away also. And that is also happening. So today, when I look at it, once there are a set of people with a set of values, with a set of objectives, they come together and they agree that we can disagree on many things. We agree on these fundamental things and move forward. I'm not speaking of a common minimum program. I'm not too concerned about that at this stage. That these are our values and we will steadfastly hold on to these 4 or 5 basic values and go forward. Once you agree on that, then the first thing you need is a narrative. And sometimes the narrative can be overwhelming, or a good cause can be lost because of a bad narrative or the way a narrative fails to take off. I think in Karnataka, the narrative took off first. Second, after the narrative comes the resources. And there is no denying the fact that at all times and at any time, the ruling party is the best endowed when it comes to resources. And contrary to assumptions of secrecy and everything, it is now quite clear where all the electoral bonds went, or where 80 or 90% of the money that came by way of electoral bonds, to whom it went and where it went. So this is the question of resources. The third thing is you need forces on the ground. You need foot soldiers on the ground. There, again, the ruling party almost always has an advantage when it goes beyond the cities, to the rural areas. because there is power, and in power there is money, there is benefit, there is profit, and power, like whether at the panchayat level or a district level, there are so many small things that come into play which trap people or bind people or lead people to certain associations and commitments. You cannot judge them always politically or morally. For instance, if how water is supplied in a, say, district where there is water scarcity, which ghettos or slums the tankers will go and which will not go, may very well decide, and who gets this water or doesn't get may very well decide how thousands of votes there go. And I'm sure that all these things are little factors that come into it. So as of now, the South, okay, there are some resources because both Tamil Nadu and Karnataka are resource states. And being in government in these two states does give a little more, strength of resources to the opposition parties. But they are also having to fight every day to stay in government and to fight off agencies which they say are persecuting them for political reasons. So how they last and how well they last and in what shape till the election is a very important question. So, like when you spoke about the Janata Party, although we didn't use the term narrative then, it was a narrative. It was a tidal wave of public mood,
Yeah, but it wasn't an advertising agency writing a narrative like Sabka Saath, whatever that is, and then putting it out. I think that whole advertising agency culture came later. But still in 77, there was a narrative that emerged. And even in that narrative, people as opposed to each other as Jansangis and socialists came together to defeat the emergency power. So do you have hope that a new narrative will emerge?
A narrative will have to emerge. If not in this election, it will have to emerge in some place, in some situation, or at least in pockets. Because sometimes the narrative will not come from where we are expecting. It is not something that one can sit and write. A narrative may write itself out of a situation, like it'll kind of emerge from a situation. And like in Karnataka, one look at the amount of money the BJP spent, the visits of the Prime Minister, the number of visits he made, the ministers, the other BJP chief ministers, the party heads, all these people went, the number of meetings and promises, and those processions where flowers were kind of poured on them and things like that. In spite of all that, and when I saw that coverage, even I felt that it is unlikely that the Congress party will win. But you see, like the people of Northern India in 77, the people of Karnataka proved that they will make a difference. And all this thing that the two people will fight, the chief ministers, they won't make up their mind, it will be a non-cohesive government. All these things were written also by people who kept kind of seeing if they could prick the balloon, but none of it succeeded. None of it succeeded. So, as you say, we don't know how and when the narrative will emerge. I agree with you. A narrative is very important. Otherwise, all the 20 leaders coming together is not going to make a difference, opposition leaders. But the fact that the Prime Minister had to call a meeting and try to revive the National Democratic Alliance and call even parties which nobody had heard of before or were considered consequential to say that they are only, 15 or 18 or 20, we are 38. That itself shows that the ground beneath their feet is not what it was before the Karnataka election. I believe the BJP has a winning chance. But I can see that the BJP itself doesn't believe that. That is the position I see now.
So I have a summary of my thoughts. I
Yes,
have,
please.
over the past 30 years, I have studied human psychology, sociology, anthropology. And one thing I have learned is that a craving for freedom is a foundational human instinct. And any encroachment on freedom of thought, a freedom of being, a freedom to self-actualize creates a sense of resentment and a desire to overcome the barriers. Though people may not have the courage, the fear may overcome action, but I think the basic instinct for freedom is where I feel hope. And I think I believe that any narrative or any action or any movement that creates hope for people like you and I needs to tap into people's desire for freedom of thought, freedom of action, and freedom of being. What would you say would be your conclusion as a part of our conversation?
No, I would say, see, when it comes to, see, it's a very, very profound issue. How people have internalized this craving, because people often aspire to what they cannot conceptualize or express, you know. As again, I would refer to the experience of the Janata Party and so on. That they might not have understood all these terms that were bandied about, like we read both bread and liberty and freedom of expression, or, you know, independent judiciary. But somewhere they realize that there has been a great injustice and kind of tyranny at work. And this has to be overthrown. So somehow, you know, at that time, although you didn't have this kind of media and technology and communication, there was some sociology of communication at work. You see? And which is this kind of sociology one has seen has been at work, whether it was in China during the Tiananmen Square incident, in Iran when the revolution was there, and in all these places, you know, that all the kind of structure of tyranny that the US and the CIA had set up in Tehran, you know, for the Shah, with holes through the door of every house and every room, could not keep them in power. See? So when the moment comes, I think there is a kind of osmotic flow of, you know, a common goal and pursuit of a common goal among people, the craving. Whether it is, see, in that book by Pearl S. Buck, The Good Earth, I still remember that film. That all those rickshaw pullers, all that are there, they're going, you know. So one of them says, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm going south." So the other guy says, "What is there in the south? The revolution. What is the revolution?" No, it's something about food. So everybody will join a kind of gathering tide or wave for their own reasons. That does not mean they are selfish seekers. Somebody for food, somebody for freedom, somebody because his child was discriminated against, somebody because the police did not kind of check the violence done to their neighbor or to their... So all these things will begin to gather, and I think they then coalesce into a kind of a gather, you know, diverse streams forming a current and then kind of building up into a wave. It will have to happen like that. You cannot say at a single point you will trigger a narrative. From there, like the kind of wellspring of from a mountain, it will spread everywhere, it will gush forth. I don't think it happens like that. But
Okay.
each situation will be different. You can't have a single prescription for how that may happen.
So I have last question before we close this conversation is, I have known you for almost 50 years now, and I've always seen you as idealistic, committed to social justice, human rights, energetic, willing or fearless, uh, and yet strategic in your writing and in your building your relationships. Today, through so many decades of experience, how are you feeling? Are you feeling as inspired, idealistic, relentless, or are you feeling tired and in despair?
No, I don't feel tired. I don't despair. I still write. You see, even when I was in Beijing and I had to write, sometimes I would wonder whether I should write. Then I discussed it. They said, no, no question. You should write. When you write from Beijing, people will say, oh, this guy has been bought over by Beijing, or he's been sent as an agent of government of India. So just because they are going to say that, I should not stop writing. There are always kind of ways and words with which one can navigate and express what one wants to. As I mentioned that incident of reporting Muhammad Yunus, you know, and so even now I write, I choose an area on which I will write. And there is always space to write what you want. And you can choose if a news click, and there were so many pods, so many YouTubes made on the farmers' agitation, which reached millions of people worldwide. If they had all despaired because they were stopped by the Haryana police or the Delhi police and not desert farmers or not this thing, what would have happened? How did this get across? The word spread across the whole world, you know. So I think I don't despair, and many people I know, we still discuss, we debate, we agree, we disagree, but we say no. This is not you. This is there is no time for despair in one life. You know.
So I have one more question. For a
Yeah.
young kid who is looking for a career, why should they consider journalism as a career when everything seems pitted against honest,
Ah,
open, fearless journalism?
that's a very important question and very interesting. I would say anyone who wants risks and thrills and dangers and challenges today should enter journalism. I'm actually surprised at the number of people who have come into journalism despite the low salaries, the difficulties, and everything. And they actually welcome the digital media. I see the digital media as practically a kind of a conspiracy of big media and big capital. You just get people nail their backsides to a chair and snag their eyeballs to the computer, tell them 9 hours, you give 5, 8, 10 stories of 200 words, and so that we can fill our black holes that we may call news or stories or whatever. But there are people who are saying we don't want these 9-hour jobs. We will go around, find news. And the most surprising thing I find is what they call these long form stories, which have become very, very fashionable. And people are writing long form stories. And I found my own articles in DNA and other places which were 600, 800 words. When I occasionally wrote a 2,000-word article, I got hundreds of kind of feedback. Then when I was writing, and this long form article will say a magazine like Caravan or Wire, all these people, it shows that people are interested in that. They find it very challenging. They find it very thrilling. You want anchoring on TV? Many people say, oh, you can become a star, but you won't be a journalist. There are many who don't want it. Every time I come across people like this, it lifts my spirits. And as you going back to the previous question, it gives me cause not to despair, you know.
Wonderful.
That's what
Shastri,
people say, let's get on in the world. Sorry?
I am so happy that I decided to do this dialogue with you. I'm very sure when younger people who watch this will be inspired to be the journalists that used to be and that were not trapped by either government controlled or corporate journalism.
Uday, thank you. You're a wonderful interlocutor to have. I don't think, sorry, anyone else would have been able to draw me out across a range of subjects, you know, making me reflect and respond as you have done spontaneously, and still bringing to it what I have known over 50 years as a journalist. I hope you have found what you want and the young people find this interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. The idea is just trigger people into thinking deeply and express fearlessly.
Thank you, Uday.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure.
And you have a good night.